How is it in New York?
Well, I'm actually upstate right now, and it just started snowing. So,
Oh, well, nice. Yeah, no,
yeah.
it's surprising. I thought the first snowfall of for Denver would come sooner, but it actually has yet to snow here.
Where are you in Denver?
I'm currently right across from the Ball Arena Stadium.
Oh,
Uh,
cool. Sure.
yeah, so I'm right next to basically right next to 16th Street Mall, right downtown Denver, where all of the skyscrapers are. So that's where
Nice,
I'm at.
nice. Yeah,
Yeah.
my sister-in-law lives just west of 35, and my brother used to live up in Evergreen. So
Oh, nice. Yeah, Evergreens a really interesting place, especially just like I think about those places and I think about how much, especially like, like the environment and more in the way of like how much housing has been built there within the last 20 years. Um, which is just like I think it's I think honestly in a broader sense, like the Western states I think have just gotten overly more popular as time has gone on, especially since the 21st century has began, which is interesting. I mean I've lived and grown up in Colorado my whole life and it feels like ever since I can remember it just keeps growing in a way.
totally, totally.
And I think that's just something really interesting about the West and especially like, you know, I mean, even just to get into it, like I think like a lot of things that you research are think of like the progression and like the transition from how the West began and where it is now, because I think its roots are still there, but it just has taken a completely different shape and form now, you know?
I mean, in the speed at which, I mean, I think that like the speed at which it happened, right, is part of
Yeah.
the I think that's that you could say the same thing about Chicago in the
Yeah.
19th century, but like it looks a lot different
Yeah.
when it's you know built in the era of suburban kind of sprawl and stuff. So
Yeah, especially like I mean, I think about this a lot, but I think about like how new the West is, like as a whole, and like, you know, for example, just to compare it to like cities in New England to cities in the West, like Denver, for example, is not that old. I think it was founded in the late 1850s, so it's like what, like 150, 160 years old. And it's just not that old to me. And so I just think it's really interesting, comparing, some of the architecture, I think like some of the older buildings in Denver share resemblance to, some of the um colony cities, but still I think it's just such a new area in like the time
hmm
of history that like not much how should I say this? Like I feel like the West was just laid open for the Industrial Revolution, I think in a sense. Like I think it just the West was found at such an important time, I think, in American history.
totally, totally, yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
First of all, I just want to say thank you for coming on here. Thank you for taking the time to meet with me and talk about some really interesting things, I think, within, first of all, living in the West. Just like for me, for example, I think I often find myself always kind of researching the most and finding my interest most within the Western side of America. And I think it's really interesting, especially for people who, haven't or maybe not been to the West. I think the West is a very unique place in American culture. I think there's like three major standpoints in American culture. There's like New England and the colony, the 13 original colony mindset, and then there's the South, and then there's the West. Just that's a really broad generalization, but I think those are like the three main cultural sentiment points within America. And I just think it's really interesting some of the research that can be done that you have done, especially when it comes to Native Americans and the evolution of environments and energy in that area. So if you don't mind, sir, can you please introduce yourself?
Sure, I'm Andrew Needham, and I teach at New York University, and I kind of write about energy and urban growth and the American West. Um, and I'm actually to put my cards on the table. I'm not a Westerner, right? I didn't
Yeah.
grow up in the American West, so I think I had that kind of the first time I really experienced the West, which was kind of a long car trip moving across the country. I had that kind of stereotypical Eastern, Easterner or Midwesterner. I grew up in the Midwest,
Yeah.
blown away by this very, very different landscape and finding it, totally fascinating. How do these places kind of exist in a very different kind of, environment with a very different past than the one that I was familiar with, kind of growing up in Wisconsin. So
Yeah, and I think it's really interesting too that you bring that up originally is that like you're not from the West. And I think, one of the first things I wanted to ask is, what are some of the, hmm, lem- just I'll start off with this. I think the West is firstly imagined as the frontier expansion, manifest destiny, all of these things I think we learn about in grade school and high school, and maybe through an introductory history course in our undergraduate careers. But I mean, when you start to really study and research the American West, what are some of the things that like you didn't really realize, and what are some of the main important things that kind of like change some stereotypes that you've thought about it, especially from like a historian's perspective? I think we spent a lot of time finding out a lot of things that we didn't know about.
sure. I mean, one of the most formative intellectual experiences I ever had, and I write about this a little bit in my book, was driving past Four Corners Power Plant, which is located, near the kind of four corners of Arizona, New Mexico, Utah, and Colorado. And what was so important about that was it didn't feel like it should be there.
Mm.
I mean, I think I had, this kind of deeply ingrained idea that, like, okay, this is kind of pristine, untouched, nature. This is indigenous land. This is not land that should be, have what looked like, a massive factory like I had seen, in Detroit there. And so that disjunction between what I expected um, areas in the West to look like and what was actually there was one of those things that really led me to try to figure out, well, how did this power plant uh, come to be? So, I mean, that, just the way that, in many ways, the West disrupts your expectations, kind of that get laid on you by those frontier stories.
Yeah, I think it's really interesting too because for example, I grew up in a town of it was called Craig, Colorado, and it's in the northwestern corner, right next to the border of Utah and Wyoming. And there's a
There's a
big
big
power,
power plant
yeah, it's a
there.
big power plant there, and that's like the main thing that people know about it. And it's actually closing down here soon. I think in 2028, early 2030s, I believe. I don't particularly know. But like that's like a huge part of, first of all, the economy of that town. And also, second of all, it's almost a part of the culture, I would say, because a lot of the people who live there, first of all, are blue collar workers, and also in a sense, have a big have a big swing of support within fossil fuels. And to have it closed down and have people talk about how Craig will be a ghost town within the 2050s and 2060s, I think is interesting because, first of all, I heard no complaints about, first of all, this power plant ever being here. It was almost seen as a good thing. And growing up, you don't really hear about maybe some of the negative effects of, these big industrial plants that don't seem to be there. And I want to connect that to a question of also what you've kind of learned about as your time studying is like, how has the story of the West shifted from being about settlement and frontier expansion and manifest destiny to being about environment, infrastructure, and also the indigenous lands of the Native Americans, such as in for Colorado, the Ute, and in New Mexico, the Navajo, and all of that.
Sure. No, I mean, the shadow side of that frontier story, that story of, of Anglo settlement, of the transformation of, of, uh, you know, land into farmland has always been dispossession and expropriation, right? Of the kind of the land and sovereignty of indigenous people. Um, and so, I think, introducing, thinking about what, one of the things I found in researching that power plant and researching the, also kind of coal mines built on Navajo land were the big divides that it created in and among Navajo people. Many people having a sense of, this is economic opportunity. This is something that will integrate the Navajo Nation into the growth that's going on in places like Phoenix, in places like Los Angeles. This will allow some kind of shared growth. There's a brief I found in the National Archives, uh, a, a proposal put forward to try to draw an NFL team to Window Rock
Mm,
on the Navajo Nation, with the idea that this kind of struck home to me, given from where I'm from. It kind of said, well, given that Green Bay, this town of, not many people, has an NFL team, why can't Window Rock have an NFL team? And on the other hand, people saying digging up the land, you know, kind of burning coal, polluting the skies, putting mercury into the water nearby. This is destroying both our local way of life and these places that have been like deeply, deeply important to us kind of over generations. There's a testimony by a woman named Many Mule's daughter that I found, where she talked about how, the drag shovels of Black Mesa Mine,
mm.
kind of located, near where the Navajo Nation and Hopi nations meet, was literally dragging up the land where her ancestors, had been laid to rest. And so this was the kind of destruction not only of land as it existed in the present, but the legacies that had tied her family to this place. So kind of found these real, you know, at times very bitter divides between people, about what did it mean to uh to care for uh to care for a people.
And I think that speaks to a in my opinion, a larger question of overall, like what like unintended consequences has energy development had in the West specifically. I mean, first of all, I want to bring up your article, A Piece of Action, because I think this is a really important take on what Navajo leadership and energy development have kind of had this strenuous relationship about. And just with what you said, especially with Black Mesa, I think Black Mesa is a very interesting area to begin with. And I think it also leads itself to, once again, these really, I think, bitter conversations that people start to have between energy development, but also sovereignty of tribal land. And so the main question I want to ask with that is like, what did that era, I think, I kind of wonder like what it revealed to you that like, first of all, native strategies for sovereignty and self-determination, having its own kind of self-governments within that system. And like, what did it reveal, I think, is a really important thing to ask.
Yeah, no, one of the things that it revealed is, like, I mean, if you go to those kind of stereotypical visions of the West, right, you get this, you know, idea of indigenous people kind of living at a different moment in time, right? Oh,
Mm.
they are, there's all of these, you can go to tourist magazines and you see all of these pictures of, you know, Navajo girls hugging sheep, wearing turquoise jewelry, and people kind of easily think, well, this is a disjunct. These aren't people living in the modern world.
Yeah.
Um, and looking at kind of how kind of Navajo leaders were responding to energy development, the the analogies they're drawing um, are to the OPEC nations that at that moment, right, are kind of showing the power that control of energy can have over a global economy. They're really thinking of themselves as, post-colonial nations. Peter McDonald, who's the chairman of the Navajo tribe, starts talking about the emerging Navajo nation, right? To say that like that we, much like the decolonizing world, are coming into a moment of power, and that energy will be the key for kind of you know gaining um, not only wealth but political power and authority. And so I say that kind of indigenous people have been thinking, you know very hard and in very productive ways about energy far longer than most Americans have because it's happened in very much in their lives and in their backyards.
Yeah, and I that's also a really good point because I mean, I think that's one of the main, I think, benefactors that they have is like that is how they do, in a way, get their sovereignty back in a way, and also like political power. Because I think for a long time they've had power in a way, but it wouldn't compare to what the United States government had. And I think taking control of that for themselves is a way that they could actually make a stand for what they want. Because I think for a long time they've just gone in a oversimplified way, they've gone scraps of what the American government has left for them. And I think another thing, because I think out of all of the things that interest me about this, I think coal mining is the one that interests me the most because I think it's one that hits close home to me that I think about a lot.
Hmm.
I also wanted to ask, in related to what we had just talked about, is like, the turn of the 20th century happens, and I wonder how energy projects within that time as well, like coal mining and electrification, for example, or even wind and solar, I think are really good things to talk about as well. How did they reshape both the Native American communities, but also like the urban landscapes of the Southwest, especially places like Phoenix? The largest city within the Mountain West is Phoenix, Arizona. And even areas like Albuquerque, I think, have very exponentially interesting areas for, energy development. And I kind of wonder, how did it reshape that?
Totally. Like Phoenix, the nth degree, and this is also similarly a story of Albuquerque and Los Angeles, have this dilemma, right? They promote themselves as new kinds of cities. These are cities that are different than
Hmm.
the cities in the East and Midwest. They're not dirty. They're not cold. They're not filled with the detritus of industrialization, right? This is not the kind of place where smokestacks are going to be kind of spewing poof
Yeah.
into the sky. And yet, to realize the growth that they seek, they need lots of energy. Um, and so one of the reasons that that power plant ends up located at Four Corners, another power plant located kind of in northern Arizona, uh, is an effort to seek a kind of technological fix to that problem. Right, energy can be the energy that they need to run, and we think air conditioners, and air conditioning is later than we usually think, but to run uh, chip factories, to run aviation plants, to draw a new industry in. All of that energy can be generated at a great distance from the central cities as they're growing. So
Yeah.
in a way, they can maintain that idea of a kind of place where you can go and have the best of both kinds of life. You can have economic growth, but you can also have quality of life without the downsides that have accompanied industrialization in other growing cities. It's and that also allows a kind of forgetting or an invisibility of where is my energy coming from to take place.
Yeah, and I think I also believe as well that's a really good point because I think a lot of times we often see that these, power plants or energy sources are put in very inconvenient areas that really
Yeah.
don't have to be there. I mean, I
And
think in
you know what this does in places like Craig, right? In places like Craig, people know a lot
yeah,
about energy. People know where that energy is going. In Phoenix and Denver, like who knows where your energy is coming from,
yeah.
right? And so there's a way in which consumers get to enjoy the benefits
Mm,
of this new geography while exporting many of the costs, right? There are benefits, right? The benefits of relatively well-paying jobs,
mm.
but exporting these kind of negative environmental aspects.
Yeah, and I also want to go off of that with like what we've kind of learned from that, especially, we are about to go into the 2030s, and I wanted to ask this as well because I think we've had so many bad experiences within the West of this. And I think, everyone says that history is always doomed to repeat itself in a way. But I always wonder, and I always have discussions with people, especially individuals from the states of New Mexico about this. But, what lessons do you think that we can or should be learned from Native American nations, specifically negotiating resources control or environmental stewardship, I think, in a way. And also, like, I think is a big one is economic autonomy. Like we were just saying, Phoenix is the largest city within the Mountain West. I think Denver's a close second. Albuquerque and Santa Fe, I think, are powerhouse cities that, that are kind of swept underneath the rug. But going back, what lessons can be learned from these things that keep seemingly apparent to happen?
I mean, I think one lesson is that um, the moment when agreements are established is deeply important for how those systems will operate moving forward. So, in the 70s, when kind of Navajo leaders are looking to OPEC and envisioning the nationalization of the kind of the energy production that's located on their land. They're largely unsuccessful in achieving those visions, right? Because the companies doing the mining, the companies building these plants, can go back to the original contract and say, well, here is, a contractual, term that says that, here is the rent that, will be paid. Here's the royalty. Here's the royalty rate. And, as a contract within American law, right, that is what will kind of, determine, what things are. I also think if you think about what power plants, electrical power lines, coal mines are. In one sense, they're part of a kind of technological infrastructure, right? Meant to bring kind of energy to, you know, turn coal into electricity at one place and transmit it to other places. But they're also forms of capital, right? They are in the investment of money into physical infrastructure. And once capital is set in place, right, then it becomes resistant to change for a kind of period of time, right? And so, like, once it's kind of on the ground, then it's going to be very hard to change uh, that system until elements of it start to become outdated or uneconomic, which is what we're seeing now with coal plants from the West, right? Is they are largely being phased out because they're both old and because they produce electricity inefficiently. And so, thinking about, those initial moments of, decision making and investment are deeply, deeply important. And it's very important for the people involved in them to have power at that moment in time.
And that makes me think of a really good point I'll bring up in a bit. But I think that's a really good another point that you brought up is that, like, once these things are kind of on the ground, they're very hard I mean, first of all, to get rid of, but even change the course of action that I think, infrastructures within the Southwest specifically tend to go on. And I think this has been happening since the late 1800s, in my opinion, but like it seems to keep going down this path. And I think it's going to be very hard for it to ever change because it seems to work for the people who want it to work, and the people who are not in favor of it, well, like we've talked about earlier, they just don't have the power to really change that. I mean, here's something that I think of a lot is, we talk about coal mining and all these things, but I have really been interested in the amount of data centers being built in the Southwest. Arizona and New Mexico, I believe in New Mexico there was something called Project Jupiter, and it was, gosh, I think 150, 180 billion dollar AI data center. And it was near the border of Texas, but still, I mean, these are things being built in people's backyards, and I think once again they're being built on land that has significant interconnectedness to it. In Arizona, I think there was another one that was like 35 billion dollars, another a data center in a sense. And I think, you know, like I said at the beginning of this, these things are just taking different shapes and forms, and I just
Mhm.
find it very hard for it to change.
Well, and I think that this is the kind of thing that has we think of you know data centers as a kind of economic enterprise, right? Like places compete to get data centers to locate there, right? Because they bring, a certain amount of investment, they bring employment, but they also have this broad social cost.
Mhm.
The way the electrical industry, uh, utility industry works today is that when demand spikes, the price paid per kilowatt hour is equalized across all kind of suppliers at the most expensive form of electricity. Um, so when you have data centers creating a kind of larger demand, you're actually raising the cost of energy for everyone. I mean, we're seeing this actually across the country right now. One of the big kind of price spikes is in electricity. Georgia has seen, I think, something like 6 rate increases over the
Mm.
past 2 years. Um, and that's largely an attempt to socialize the cost of these data centers, raising the amount of baseline demand.
Mm.
And so you see these kinds of dynamics. I mean, at the same, I'll also say that um, indigenous nations have been really smart recently about um, making sure when they, invest, when they have wind and solar development on their land, that there's
Yeah.
a much higher rate of return to them um, than there was in the 50s and 60s
Yeah.
when, kind of coal mines and coal burning power plants were built on their land.
And I wonder like what parallels like you start to see when we look at like past extractive projects like coal, and then even in today's energy landscape of more focus, I think, on renewable, but also it's still that expansion, whether it's fossil fuel or renewable or not, it's still that expansion on native lands. Like what parallels do you start to see, I wonder?
I mean, I think that the parallels are the way in which the this geography of somewhere else
Okay.
um, uh, for is attractive,
Yeah.
right? Particularly for areas with political power, right? To locate um, the parts of the daily demand of urban life, uh, elsewhere on locations with less power, with less political power, right? I think that that's a kind of, you know, pattern that uh, continues. I think those places um, where things are being located are becoming better at making, uh, at realizing that the politics of somewhere else actually brings them an amount of kind of power and authority that they can make claims on. So,
Yeah, and I think also as well, it's I think in part due to the environmental challenges of that area. I mean, I mean, there's a lot of them I think about, but so the main ones I can think about are water scarcity in certain areas, especially southern Arizona, southern New Mexico, even Texas, for example, but also like land use and the influence that both that has on like public policy in the area, but also in first of all, more importantly, the lives of Native and non-Native American residents. And I suppose what I believe that means is that these environmental challenges that I just list, I think, influenced the policy to make it to where these residents were to be felt like they were being helped out, when in reality, they were having these things built in areas that meant a lot of them. So I think a lot of people didn't really know what was going on at that time. And even now, I feel like a lot of people don't really understand especially the popularity of these areas growing. I think, you know.
Hmm.
Specifically, the Southwest is growing a lot. The Phoenix area, New Mexico in certain areas. It seems to be growing a lot, and that these environmental challenges, I think, have been a testament to that popularity in a way.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think one of the fundamental contradictions of you know, current American political economy, right, is that the kind of environmental demands of of new development are often and new development is often pursued um, you know in ways that are deeply blind
Yeah.
to uh, the the kind of amount of resources that are available. Uh, and then, the solution is, I mean, you know, uh, the solution that's carried forth is to kind of pass some of those demands, like in terms of water, particularly,
Yeah.
onto homeowners, right? And to say that, like, okay, well, you bought this house, but your water rights are not secured in parts of suburban Phoenix right now. Certain developments are seeing their water turned off,
Mm.
and people are having to kind of, have water trucked in uh, to them, and filling up tanks outside their homes, which is the same thing that happens actually on the Navajo Nation.
Yeah.
So these places are becoming actually closer, kind of in some ways closer together in the ways that that kind of environmental limitations are being kind of made kind of evident and clear.
Yeah, and I think it goes back to one of the questions we just talked about earlier is like who reaps the benefits and who bears the cost. And going off of that, I also wanted to ask in a way like what can the Southwest teach us about like broader American environmental history? Because I think, for example, the East and the West are two completely different places. It just is. And I think like what can the Southwest teach us about that, especially in areas like we've talked about this entire time, or Arizona and New Mexico?
I mean, one of the phenomena that's really interesting about places like Phoenix, all of these cities, in the Southwest that really see kind of booms in the years after World War II,
Yeah.
um, is that they're some of the first cities in the United States um, to grow explosively without a connection to a kind of industrial transformation. Um, so if you think of Detroit, like Detroit explodes in size because of the auto industry, Pittsburgh because of the steel industry, New York because of commerce, right? But also because of manufacturing. Um, when Phoenix starts to grow in the 1940s and early 1950s, the um, the elites running Phoenix, so basically the political and commercial elite, are terrified because they basically say our main industries right now are canning and broom manufacturing, and yet we have tens of thousands of people moving here every year. What are they going to do? Um, and what was going on that they didn't realize is that Phoenix and then much of suburban America is really, a location where the industry is real estate development.
Yeah.
And real estate development, right? All industry comes with a certain kind of environmental demand. But real estate development comes with particular demands for, supplies of residential water, for electricity, and for the infrastructure to support them. So I think one of the kind of environmental stories that Phoenix allows us to see is like, what does a like how does a real estate economy transform uh, environments, and on what scale does it do so? Um, and you can kind of trace stories about the scale of urban resource use back to Rome, right? But it becomes really evident in the years after World War II that cities are having these massive, massive reaches far beyond the borders of even their kind of furthest flung suburbs.
Yeah, and I think that's really interesting, especially when we start talking about, the post-war West and the boom that it has had. And going back to what you were saying about the about especially real estate, because I want to say that I think, off topic, when we talk about media, I think the Southwest is often portrayed as an empty desert, New Mexico, Arizona, even Utah and Colorado in a sense. But I think when you start to kind of look behind the curtains in a way, it's a very interconnected space, especially between cultures, especially within the four corner states, especially. And I wanted to say and also ask you, I mean, like I think geography and ecology have had a pronounced uh I think weight on shaping the politics and identity of the region. But I want to ask you, like, how has it done that? Because I think it's such a different area than most of the places within the United States. And to restate the question, how did the geography and ecology of these areas shape the politics and identity of the region? Because I think it's a very unique area, you know?
Yeah. No, I mean, in a way, you have one of the paradoxes of kind of American politics of the last 70 years, where you have, people saying, you know, leave me alone, the government, leave me alone, right? I'm
Yes.
an individual, that are the most deeply dependent on public action to allow their, their lives and economies to sustain
Yeah.
themselves. The people that helped Phoenix grow, starting in the 1930s and 1940s, are some of the savviest users of the changes put in place by the New Deal.
Hmm.
They're very much going and looking, how can we use uh, FHA insurance? How can we use the GI Bill's loan
Yeah.
guarantees in order to fuel this new residential landscape that we're building? They they fly out bankers from the East, uh, um, you know, in February, obviously. You play golf, say, hey, here's a tranche of mortgages that this bank, that Valley Bank, located in Phoenix, wants to sell off into, the nation's financial markets. So, Phoenix starts to get wrapped into these cycles of kind of real estate capitalism that, eventually, like if you took a very long view, right? This is one of the things that cracks in 2008 with the financial crisis.
Yeah.
But they're very savvy users of that system. At the same time that these same people, Barry Goldwater, very prominently is, is launching kind of broad scale attacks
Yeah.
against American liberalism, against an expansive federal state, against the federal government coming in and kind of you know uh, you know uh, intervening in local politics. So kind of it's this it's this, I'm an individual and give me my public health
Yeah, and I think that's a really
dynamic.
interesting part of the culture there too, because I think it's especially grown larger and larger as time has gone on.
And I think
Especially,
there's something, I do think, to get the second other part of your question, I do think that the physical geography, right, allows something, does have some element of that. I mean, there is more space
yeah,
in in Phoenix. It seems like a place where, I mean, the single family home is the dominant, residential uh form, right? This allows people to be like, I am an individual, I own property, I'm not living with a wall connected to someone else,
yeah.
right? um so I think those things do go hand in hand.
I agree with that as well. Especially, I have spent limited time in the areas of Arizona, more New Mexico, but in Colorado, I think it's interesting as well. Because I think Colorado, especially Denver, is one of those areas that seems to be switching as time goes on and on. one of the largest cities in the Mountain West. And but also I think it has a completely different feeling and culture than, let's say, in Phoenix, because even though these areas are both in the Mountain West, I think Denver has lent itself to becoming more, I think, in the way that maybe the East thinks in a way. It's becoming predominantly more diverse and popular to even move to, especially from the East and even from California, which is different within itself too. It's interesting to see that change as time goes on, especially when you live there as well.
And I think this is something that's happened in Phoenix too, right? I mean, I think this story of, the desirability of urban living and density, right, over
Yeah.
the past 20 years, right, has been a story that historians have only started to grapple with, right? I mean, as you know, basically, if something's within the last 25 years, we have a hard time like wrapping our head. We have a hard
Yeah.
time wrapping our heads historically around the things that we live in our daily lives. But you
Yeah.
certainly see, like, and one indication of this, right, is I mean, what rent prices look like in
Yeah.
Denver. Similar story. I mean, people have looked at Phoenix's rent prices and saying, "Oh my God, what's happening here? This was always a place defined by kind of, low rents, low housing prices, since 2008 and certainly since the pandemic. Then, those rents have spiked up as people, are looking to density as um, a positive value rather than something that was, in the 50s, that was, the antithesis of what Phoenix builders, saw. Well, we're not dense, we're open, um, and that, led to a certain kind of, you know, lifestyle that when you have 300,000 people, it might be, it's okay. When you have 6 million, it becomes, your daily life becomes a lot of sitting in traffic.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, especially with Phoenix as well, I have to agree with that because and I've been to Phoenix a handful of times, but even though I said that they're differently, I still see the similarities between the two because I mean, let's just go with a simple example. Like traffic is just ridiculous in these two cities. And also, I think as well, I think people have a right to be frustrated because, 20 years ago, 40 years ago, we go back in time, it was so much easier to, I think, find a place here because it was a newer place that's been established and it was cheaper. And I think with the amount of jobs that have been created from, let's say, energy development, it's just growing at a rapid rate that I think sometimes it ends up eating itself in a way.
I mean, in a way, it's kind of gotten as wide as it is, as it can, you know, get. And
Yeah.
now cities are going up in a way.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think as well, I think I would make a prediction that this will spread to other states as well, even some states that we may not even think about. I think Utah is one that is increasingly getting more, Salt Lake City, and I think even in places like Montana, even up north, I think it's just like a evolution of technology, and with the human population within these areas just rising, it's just I think bound to happen. And
I would be really interested to see, like, if you looked over time, like in the recent past,
yeah,
um, have you seen i- a rise in the percentage of households, two-person households, that has only one car, right? I mean, that
yeah,
seems to be a marker, of, is it possible to live in these places without both working family members having to get in a car, every day. The last time I went to Phoenix, I was staying in Tempe. I did the whole trip aside from a few Uber, trips
yeah,
on the light rail.
yeah.
So, I think that, there are ways in which the kind of urban transformation is, you know, you know, ongoing in those. I mean, certainly it's certainly happening in Denver.
Yeah, and I was just gonna say along with that, like you can pretty much get to wherever you need to go through the light rail as well within Denver. But I think about some of the more I think about some of the more northern Western states, and it seems increasingly more prevalent that every member of the household has to have a vehicle.
Hmm.
I think about Wyoming a lot too in that sense, because I think Wyoming is one of those like, well, first of all, it's the least populated state within the United States, and I think along with that, it's different than some,
One
and
car in
it's a,
Wyoming would be tough.
yeah, it's hard, and so I like to compare those two because I think they're a lot of different. And I think about how even within the Mountain West, some areas are just so much more different than others. Places in Montana or Wyoming versus places in the Southwest of New Mexico and Arizona, it is showing to be more increasingly prevalent that one area is growing more than the other. But also in a way, every area in the West is growing in some way due to, like we've talked about this entire thing, energy development and infrastructure and real estate. Um, And it's I wonder, I think about this a lot, and I write about this a lot, is like I wonder what the future of the American West looks like. It's something I'm fascinated by, you know, especially I think past the 2050s. I just wonder how this area works.
I mean, I think that that's been like, particularly in thinking in environmental terms. I think that that's, obviously a question that has long kind of loomed over Arizona, right?
Um,
This belief that this is a fundamentally unsustainable place,
yeah.
and that at some point this will crack. Or there's an amazing dystopian. I don't know if you've ever seen this book by Paulo Baglioppi called The Water Knife.
I've never heard of
Um,
it.
oh, it's great. It's great. It's a dystopian novel. The states of the West go to war over water, seal their borders from each other. But it's part of this kind of dystopian story that at some point things will totally fall apart. And I
Mm,
actually don't think, I mean, it, you know, that is not what will happen. And, kind of as a historian, I think what will happen, right, is save some kind of political intervention, is we'll see
uh,
an even greater kind of disjunction of inequality happen in the West, right? Where
yeah.
people with the least power, have the most kind of burdens, the most ecological burdens placed kind of
Yeah.
upon them. I mean, the last week, Bill Gates made this kind of announcement that he no longer thinks that climate change will destroy humanity.
Mm,
Um, that was always a ridiculous idea to put forward, right? What people who are trying to combat climate change are trying to do are saying, we know that if climate change continues unchecked, the damage that it reaps will be felt most profoundly by the world's poor.
yeah.
Um, and that the danger was never the eradication of humanity. It was the immiseration of billions of people. And
Yeah.
I was very depressed to see like Bill Gates not get that, like which seems kind of fundamental. So I mean, I think that that's like the real question of the future of not only the West, but of you know the nation and the world, is like, will um, people figure out a politics, right, that can avoid the kind of the cruelty that will come with the immiseration of people as kind of ecological catastrophe proceeds, or will they kind of accede to this world of kind of giant divisions where the wealthy can exist kind of untouched by pain, and the non-wealthy are faced with very, very difficult lives.
Yeah, and you just saying that makes me think of one state, and that's New Mexico, because I think New Mexico has a really big problem with that. I've been to New Mexico a lot within the few recent years, and I think I keep noticing that dilemma as more prevalent than let's say Arizona and New Mexico because I see it all the time. The the rich live outside of Santa Fe, and that's a very well kept area. And then on the outskirts, let's say towards western New Mexico, towards the border of Arizona, you have a lot of that energy development, and even towards the east of New Mexico, near the border of Texas. And then places like Albuquerque are literally ranked the worst places to live. I mean, New Mexico was recently ranked one of the second or third worst states to live in due to quality of life. And I think those are some of the consequences that we're talking about and that we're starting to see.
That really, that's really interesting.
It,
That's really interesting that it's being felt most profoundly right now in New Mexico.
yeah,
Um,
I think it's changing the way that people think about the Southwest and how it's grown over time. Even in places like, California, these places are some of the largest cities in the world. Albuquerque is the largest city within New Mexico, but yet it's ranked one of the worst places to live in the United States. And it's really interesting how that happens. Because I'm sure a time before probably I was alive, it wasn't that way, and it was a still new and unkept area.
hmm hmm And I mean, I think Albuquerque and New Mexico also have this aesthetic that hides some of that,
Yeah.
right? The aesthetic of the adobes, the aesthetic of
Hmm.
the Spanish colonial homes, and we say, oh, here's a city kind of located that's sensitive to its place.
Yeah.
um, um, that you can look at a really a wealthy compound in Albuquerque and a poor house, and they architecturally you
E-
can say, oh, these look architecturally
the same.
similar,
Yeah.
so it kind of masks what's going on kind of under the surface.
Yeah. And I think that's a really interesting thing that people don't, I think, really think about the architectural style of that area. And I think it's a I think it's a big attractor to people also as well. Um,
No,
but
I was just in New Mexico 3 weeks ago, and it was a very attractive place to be. So
yeah, and it's fun. It's I think
yeah,
it's yeah, I think it just goes back to that main attractiveness that it has. And but also, I mean, before we go, I wanted to ask one more question
sure.
about the American West is like what is if you could correct one misconception about the American West, what can it be? And I think even,
Yeah.
to even just hone on that a little bit more, you teach in New York. What's like one thing that I think students don't really realize, especially people who are from that area, from New York, from the East, that don't really understand about the West, and or more specifically the Southwest.
I think it would be that uh, Indigenous Americans are modern people,
Mm.
who continue to exist, and have a great diversity of political beliefs and opinions. I mean, I think that in a way that we are still here is one of the modern indigenous rights movements key slogans, right? Really speaks to the ignorance about kind of indigenous life that's endemic, you know, in a lot of places, in the East, and and in many places in the West. So I think that would be the main thing that I would uh, you know want to eradicate. It's something I try to do kind of early on in my teaching. Uh, so I think that would be the main one.
I think that's a great misconception as well, because especially like even I think when we start talking about Native Americans, an image pops in someone's head. And I think something because I had not
Yeah.
visited a reservation until I was a teenager. The first ever one I went to was the Ute in southern Colorado, and then the Navajo. But I even went to the one in the Wind River Reservation in Wyoming. These are modern people just like us who deal with modern problems. I think it's really interesting when we start talking about some of the modern issues that tribal lands have had to deal with, such as like Wi-Fi. Like those are really
Yeah,
interesting topics that like people don't think that they have to deal with, and it's just like they do. Or even like for example, criminal justice when a crime takes place between tribal lines. It's really interesting, or even, for example, police departments within American reservations and their own specific schooling and their own self-government in a way is a really interesting topic that people don't quite understand because people just don't think these people don't deal with modern problems, but they do.
100%.
Yeah.
100%.
Anyways, but Andrew, thank you for coming on here. I really enjoyed
It
talking about this. I really appreciate it.
was great talking to you, Broden. Have a good
Yeah.
day.
You too. Thanks, man. Have a good one.